Hey everyone, welcome to Sidetrack Adventures. This is Steve. Today we're going to do something a little bit different and use a guidebook from the 1930s to try and take a tour of Old Town San Diego. This is one of the most historic parts of the city, being the place of the first European settlement in California, so it'll be interesting to see what's changed over the decades and if it's even still possible to use this guidebook nearly 90 years later. We are starting out today at Presidio Park, which overlooks Old Town. This is where the first mission in California was built in 1769, though the tour has us starting where Fort Stockton once stood. For this tour, we're going to be using the 1937 WPA Guide to San Diego, and this is actually a reprint of the original guide. In the 1930s, the Works Progress Administration, in order to keep people working as the Great Depression was going on, produced a series of guides to places all over the United States. This guide is full of information on the history and culture of the city, and in the back it has a list of tours. We're going to be doing the tour of Old Town. The idea for this video came from another YouTube channel called Dime Store Adventures, which is a great channel and one of my favorites to watch, so full credit to him for the idea. And rather than using a modern map, we will also be using a 1937 map of Old Town for the tour, which should be mostly the same, though I do see at least one issue that's going to come up. Presidio Park is big, at about 37 acres, but this tour starts us out where Fort Stockton once stood. According to the guide, in 1838, a small fort was built on this hill by the Mexican townsfolk as protection against an anticipated Indian attack. Then in 1846, during the Mexican-American War, American forces occupied the fort. Commander Robert Stockton took command, and trenches were dug around the fort, and we can still see evidence of those trenches today. This flagpole is not mentioned in the guide, but it was dedicated in 1937, so around the same time the guide was written. The American flag on this pole is visible for miles. The guidebook does talk about a Spanish cannon that's mounted up here called El Jupiter that was cast in Manila in 1783. It looks like this is where it was, but it's no longer here. It's now in the Serra Museum. There is a great view from where the cannon was, though. This is a monument to the Mormon Battalion. It's not in the guide, so it was definitely added after 1937. I should mention that we're most certainly going to pass up some interesting sights in Old Town, but I'm going to try and stick to the guide as it was written in 1937 as much as possible. The guide says that to the right of the fort site is a monument for Padre Palu, who was a co-worker and biographer of Father Junipero Serra, who founded the first mission here. But I don't see it anywhere, so it's likely long gone. We've now moved across the park, and this is one of the most famous buildings in San Diego, and a lot of people think it's older than it actually is. I mean, it is old, but it doesn't date back to Spanish times or anything like that. This was built in 1929 and is the Serra Museum. The Serra Museum is often mistaken for a Presidio or a mission, but the Presidio was right here. There isn't much left of it above ground, but this wall surrounds where it was located. There isn't a whole lot to see in here, but this is where the first European settlement in California was located. The only pieces of the old Presidio that can kind of still be seen is this cross, because it was built in 1913 from pieces of brick and tile that were found around here. So this is said to be original brick from the Presidio. Also near the cross, there is a time capsule that was placed here on San Diego's 200th anniversary in 1969 and will be opened on San Diego's 300th anniversary in 2069. This area is the site of the first cemetery in San Diego, and bodies are buried all throughout these grounds, but the markers are long gone. Well, there is one marker for Sylvester Patty, who was the first American buried in California, but this is almost certainly not where he's actually buried, and is most likely in that field somewhere. According to the guide, this is the best preserved portion of the Presidio site, though nothing is visible here now. The guide also talks about a statue called The Indian by Arthur Putnam. In the last few years, that statue was removed in order to protect it from the elements and potential vandalism. I took this picture of it in 2021. I'm not sure when this observation deck was built, but it is mentioned in the guide. It also says that a palm tree below us is thought to have been planted in 1769 by Father Serra himself, but I'm not certain what tree. I only see one, so maybe it's this one. I also thought they only lived about 100 years or so, but maybe some types live longer. This probably would have been a better view in 1937, before the interstate was built with the San Diego River down below us. But I think it's time to head down the hill to the next stop on our tour. I had mentioned that there was at least one issue with the 1937 map. Well, this is it. The street that we're supposed to head down, Wallace Street, has been trunicated in the last 90 years, so we're going to have to go around. So we've refound Wallace Street. Sometime in the last 90 years, they built a golf course on top of half the street. Our next stop on the tour is something of a secret in San Diego, and something I think would surprise a lot of people. The answer to the trivia question of what is San Diego's oldest building? The golf shop on the Presidio golf course is the Casa de Carrillo, which was built in the first quarter of the 1800s by Captain Ruiz. Then in the 1830s, it was given to the Carrillo family. It was already a clubhouse for the golf course by the time this guide was written in 1937. According to this plaque, it was built around 1810, but I've seen it said elsewhere that it was built in 1817. A lot of people would probably guess that the Mission San Diego would be the oldest building in the city, but that's largely a recreation that dates back to the late 1800s. This building has sat here for over 200 years. We are at stop 3, and this is the first site on the tour that is completely gone. According to the guide, Congress Hall is a barn-like wooden structure, also known as the French Bakery. Around 1870, it was remodeled and became Congress Hall. Well, there's no barn-like structure here today. The building was torn down in 1939. Luckily, we don't have far to go to get to our next stop. We just have to pass where Congress Hall once was. The building is a Mexican restaurant. I've never tried it, so I can't say if it's any good or not. But here we are, stop 4 on our 1937 guide to Old Town San Diego. Old Town Plaza. This small park was the center of town activities and was surrounded by homes on all sides in the early 1800s. There was a major fire in San Diego in 1872, which destroyed a good portion of Old Town, so it's surprising as many old buildings survived as there are. There is the flagpole in the center of the park, and just as the guidebook says, to our right there is a boulder with a plaque on it, and if we walk over here, this should be the spot where the first American flag was raised over San Diego. The guide was still accurate about the last monument, but it also talks about a cannon near the flagpole called El Capitan, a companion piece to El Jupiter at Fort Stockton, which as we know is gone. It seems El Capitan is gone too. I know that one was here a few years ago, but I'm not sure where it's moved to. It doesn't appear to be in the plaza anywhere at all anymore. The guide does say that in the northeast corner of the park, there is a boulder for the end of the Kearney Trail, the road from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, that General Kearney led American troops to San Diego on in 1846. And sure enough, it's still here. Also in the northeast corner of the park is our fifth stop on the tour, Casa dei Bandini, which has been restored to look as it did in the 1870s when it was the Cosmopolitan Hotel. The adobe first floor was built in 1829, and the owner, Don Juan Bandini, sided with the Americans in the Mexican-American War and let General Stockton use this as his headquarters. The second floor was added in 1869, and in 1937 it was owned by the grandson of Juan Bandini and was being used as a rooming house. It has been majorly restored over the years and is operating as a hotel again. From the porch of the Cosmopolitan Hotel, we can see stop 6 on the tour, which is Casa de Estudio. This was built around 1828. There was a popular book in the late 1800s called Ramona by Helen Hunt Jackson, and this place promoted itself as the place where Ramona was married in the book. That wasn't true, but they did good business off it for a while. According to the guide, this place was in ruins by 1910, when it was restored and turned into a museum of early California. The building has a great-looking cupola on the roof, but it isn't mentioned in the guide because it was added sometime after 1937. Right behind this spot to tie off our horses is stop 7 on our tour, Casa de Pedro Reina. This was built around 1838 by Don Miguel Pedrorena, who sided with the Americans during the Mexican-American War, and he had the cannon El Jupiter buried in this building's yard so that it wouldn't fall into the hands of Mexican forces. These days, it's a mineral and gem shop. They have some pretty cool stuff for sale in here, such as actual woolly mammoth hair. Stop 8 on the tour is the Church of the Immaculate Conception. According to the guide, this church was started in 1868, but not completed until 1919. That isn't exactly true. A church was started in 1868, but they tore all of that down and restarted in 1914. If you see any old pictures, the 1860s style is completely different than how the church looks today. The guide also states that it follows closely the designs made for it by Father Antonio Ubach, which were selected from the best examples of California mission architecture, with massive stucco walls and a red-tiled roof, which is of course still evident today. It also says that the church bells were cast from metal from 6 of the earliest California bells. Our ninth stop is right across the street, and it is the Whaley House, which is probably the most famous building in San Diego's Old Town, thanks to its status as America's most haunted house. However, the guidebook makes no mention of ghosts at all when talking about the Whaley House. I'm not sure if it wasn't thought of as a haunted house yet in 1937, or if the subject of ghosts was just something that wasn't going to fly in a government-produced publication. One of the reasons it's rumored to be haunted is that in 1851, a man named Yankee Jim was hanged here, and the house was built on top of where the gallows once stood. And while the guide doesn't mention any hauntings, it does mention the hanging. When this guidebook was written in 1937, Corinne Lillian Whaley, who is now said to be one of the ghosts that haunt the house, still lived here. We are coming up on stop 10, which is the El Campo Santo Cemetery. The cemetery used to be bigger, and when they shrunk it, a lot of the graves ended up outside the walls, so you could see grave markers on the sidewalk and in the street. This was the city's Roman Catholic cemetery from roughly 1850 till about 1880. According to the guide, this was originally private property of the Pedrorena family, and you needed their permission to be buried here. About 600 people were buried in this cemetery. Quite a few notable early San Diegans, including some early mayors, are buried here. We talked about Yankee Jim, who was hanged where the Whaley House is now. He is buried here. His crime that he was hanged for, if anyone was wondering, was stealing a rowboat. They tried him under a horse theft law. And of course, this is another place that people claim is haunted. Stop 11 on the tour is long gone. It's the site of the cobblestone jail. The builder basically ripped off the city, building a jail that fell down the first time it rained, then charging to rebuild it, and doing no better job the second time. According to the guide, the cobblestone jail will be restored by the city in the near future. It's been nearly 90 years, so something tells me that isn't happening. A sheriff's museum was built on the site where the cobblestone jail once was, but it closed a few years ago due to lack of funding. So this is the second site in the guide that has just completely disappeared since 1937. Now we are at the Adobe Chapel, which is stop 12. This was built as a home by John Brown in 1850. In 1858, it was purchased by Jose Antonio Aguirre and turned into a church. Unlike the place we saw earlier, this was where Ramona got married in the book. At least according to this guide, and I guess a sign on the church. I don't think the place is actually named in the book, but I'm not 100% sure. I've never read it. The church was restored in 1937 by the Works Progress Administration, and it must have been early enough in the year that it's actually mentioned in the guidebook. Since it's not open and we can't access the grounds, there isn't a lot to see here, so on to the next spot. Down this street is where our next stop, the Derby House, would have been, but Interstate 5 was built through here, and the house is no longer here. They did save it by moving it in the 1960s though, and it sits behind the Whaley House now. But we are sticking to the guide as it was written. As we head to stop 14, I'm going to read from the guide to see what it has to say about it. Casa de Lopez, built before 1850, was used by a branch of the Lopez family. Its site gives a commanding view of Old Town to the front. In the early days, it was backed by the San Diego River, which ran where the railroad track is now. Standing in an isolated location, the Lopez house looks as if it's been untouched for the past century. Well, that description didn't quite stand the test of time. Casa de Lopez is now a rockin' Baja lobster. Not quite the isolated location it used to be, but to be fair, when this guide was written, you couldn't buy a bucket here filled with chicken, steak, and lobster, which you can now. And to be honest, the food smells really good. I personally think turning this historic building into a restaurant is a better use than letting it sit here empty, decaying, or even worse, tearing it down to build something new. Turning around, unfortunately the commanding view of Old Town from the front of Casa de Lopez that the guide talks about isn't really here anymore either. Stop 15 on this tour, Casa de Coda, once stood where that parking lot across the street is now. The Army tore the building down during World War II to build temporary housing, and the only sign that it was ever here is, well, an actual sign. We're heading towards stop 16 now, and coming up on our right is the old Mason Street Schoolhouse, the first public school in San Diego that opened in 1865. And we have a wildlife sighting here, a neighborhood squirrel. Even though this school is from the 1860s, it's not listed in this guide because it wasn't here in the 1930s. It was moved here in the 1950s. What we're looking for is right over here, Casa de Stewart, or as it's known today, Casa de Machado y Stewart. This building was supposedly built in the 1830s by Corporal Jose Manuel Machado, San Diego's first Manny Machado. In the 1840s, Machado's daughter Rosa married John C. Stewart, and they lived here. At the time this guide was written in 1937, the Stewart family apparently still owned this place. Now it's done up to look like it would have in the 1800s, but I believe the family lived here until the mid-1960s. This cactus on the side of the house has probably been around nearly as long as the house has. It looks like we could take a peek in the Stewart bedroom as well. See how a bedroom would have looked in the mid-1800s. So we have one more stop after this on this 1937 tour, and it's another building related to the Machado family. We're heading to the last stop, and we're passing by the old San Diego Courthouse and City Hall. This is actually a reconstruction that was built in the 1980s. This is the final stop in the guide, Casa de Machado, or as it's known today, Casa de Machado y Silvas. According to the guide, this is one of the best preserved of the old adobe houses. The guide also states that there is a tradition that this house was built in 1831 by Corporal Machado for his daughter Maria de Silvas. Even though the guidebook says the house was built in 1831, the sign out front says 1843. Usually the newer information is more accurate, as there's been more time to do research over the last 90 years. During the Mexican-American War, some people in town sided with Mexico, and others with the United States. When it appeared the Americans were going to capture San Diego, Mrs. Silvas rescued the Mexican flag from the plaza and hid it in this house so that the Americans couldn't capture it. For that reason, this house is also known as Casa de la Bandera. Even though a lot of the buildings aren't original, they did a good job with some of the reconstruction to the point where it's hard to tell. But it would have looked much different here in 1937. For a nearly 90-year-old guide, I think this book did pretty good. Only 3 places were completely gone, and 1 more moved. That's a decent average. And that's our 1937 tour of Old Town San Diego. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and we'll see you next week.